You won't believe what's been happening in the world of Formula One lately. The FIA, the body that governs the sport, has been shaking things up in a way that's got drivers fuming. Recently, there's been a string of shocking changes. Two major figures have been dismissed, and the drivers are now demanding answers. They want clarity on who's next and why it's all happening. For the drivers, it's getting out of hand. The lack of transparency is making things worse than ever. Take the recent firings, for example. Jeanette Tan, who was supposed to step in as the F2 race director, was let go just days before she was due to take over. This meant Rui Marcus, the current F1 race director, had to juggle even more responsibilities. And it doesn't stop there. Tim Mayer, a senior FIA steward, was removed after an argument with the FIA president over the track invasion incident at the United States Grand Prix. If you're thinking that's a lot of drama, you're right. But here's the real kicker: the drivers still don't know why it's happening. George Russell, the director of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, made it clear he found out about Tan's resignation through the media, not through any official communication. This sudden shuffle has left the drivers frustrated, and they've made it clear they want consistency, especially as the sport gears up for the next race. And this isn't just a one-off situation. There's been a wave of departures from the FIA in recent months, including high-level resignations. It's all starting to raise some serious questions about the stability of the organization that's supposed to be running the sport. It's clear that the FIA is facing some serious challenges right now, and it's not just the drivers who are feeling the heat. Fans and teams alike are starting to wonder, how long can this go on? The constant turnover at the top is creating an unstable environment, and Russell hit the nail on the head when he pointed out how difficult it must be for the FIA staff too. Imagine constantly adjusting to new leadership, new rules, and a changing vision with every turnover. The communication problems aren't just annoying, they're affecting the whole sport. Russell called out the FIA for failing to communicate properly, especially when it comes to important changes. When you have high-level staff members leaving and new ones coming in, the sport needs answers. Drivers are finding it harder to adjust to the rapid changes, and for teams trying to stay competitive, it's becoming a nightmare. Consistency is everything in racing, and right now, there's a serious lack of it. The drivers are tired of this back and forth with the FIA. They just want to know where things are heading. Russell's frustration is understandable, especially when the only way he found out about key changes like Tan's resignation was from the press. It's like being left in the dark, and when you're a driver on the world stage, that's the last thing you need. But the story doesn't end there. There's more turmoil brewing, and it has to do with the FIA's handling of race regulations. As we move toward the Qatar Grand Prix, the drivers have been pushing for clarity on new rules and changes to track behavior, especially after some controversial moves during recent races. There's a growing concern that these shifts in leadership and regulation could affect the future of Formula One in ways we haven't even fully realized yet. Now, with all the recent shakeups at the FIA, one thing's clear: the drivers are losing patience. They're not just upset about the firings and leadership changes, they're frustrated with the way race regulations are being handled too. Remember the clash between Max Verstappen and Lando Norris in Austin? That incident raised a lot of eyebrows. And it wasn't just the fans who were talking about it, the drivers themselves were asking for clearer guidelines on what's acceptable racing behavior. So what happened? Well, the FIA finally acknowledged the issue. After a lengthy discussion with the drivers before the Qatar Grand Prix, they decided to take a hard look at the rules. They're looking at aggressive moves, especially on the inside lines. If you've watched the sport long enough, you know that some moves, while daring, can also be dangerous. The FIA wants to ensure that drivers are safe, but at the same time, they don't want to take away the spirit of competition. Here's where it gets interesting. The drivers agreed that there needed to be adjustments to the rules around overtaking and driving on the inside line. George Russell, speaking on behalf of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, said the key takeaway from the meeting was this: if you're overtaking on the inside, you need to be able to stay on track. Sounds pretty simple, right? But it's a crucial point that affects how races are called and how the stewards make their decisions. In other words, if a driver is pushing to pass on the inside and can't make it stick without going off track, that's where the controversy arises. The rules as they stand right now put the responsibility on the inside driver to leave enough room, but that could change. Russell hinted that this might not just be a tweak, it could be a total overhaul of how these situations are handled. As the drivers continue to push for clearer rules and more consistency from the FIA, the conversation is shifting from the people in charge to the track conditions themselves. You see, while changes to race regulations are important, the tracks are a huge part of the problem too. George Russell made a key point during the discussions: the circuits themselves are allowing risky behavior. In other words, the tracks are too forgiving. letting drivers take risks they wouldn't usually attempt if there were more gravel or tougher boundaries. Take Austin as an example. After Verstappen's move on Norris, many agreed that if the track had gravel or more severe runoff areas, Verstappen wouldn't have attempted that maneuver in the first place. The risk of going off track would have been too high. Russell mentioned a few tracks where similar things have happened, like Austria's Turn 4 in Silverstone at Stowe. These are tricky corners where drivers can push the limits sometimes too far, because the runoff areas don't penalize them enough. The issue is that the tracks have a big impact on how drivers race. If a driver knows there's no gravel or tough penalty for going wide, they might take more chances. And with F1's high-speed racing, one wrong move can be disastrous. It's a balanced track design needs to challenge drivers without putting them in dangerous situations. Russell and his fellow drivers have been vocal about wanting changes to the tracks themselves, not just the rules. They believe that until circuits are designed in a way that naturally prevents risky moves, there will always be confusion over what's acceptable racing. That's why the FIA's latest changes are focused not just on the rules but on the infrastructure of racing itself. But as much as the FIA is trying to address the race regulations and track conditions, it's clear that communication is still the biggest issue. Lewis Hamilton brought up a key point during the meeting in Qatar. Drivers need more than just rules, they need clear, consistent communication from the FIA, especially when it comes to penalties and what's acceptable on track. Hamilton suggested something that's pretty common in other sports: a warning system. Think of it like a yellow card in football. A driver gets one warning for breaking the rules, and if they keep pushing it, then they face a penalty. Sounds simple, right? But here's the catch: the drivers quickly realize that this idea might not work in F1. Waiting until the end of the season to use your one warning doesn't quite cut it. That's because racing is so fast-paced, and sometimes the consequences of a bad move are immediate. You can't afford to wait until the final race to make sure you're following the rules. So what's the solution? Ongoing conversations. The drivers and the FIA have been discussing ways to fine-tune the rules throughout the season, not just after an incident occurs. Russell summed it up perfectly: the guidelines don't need a complete overhaul. They just need a few minor tweaks to make sure everyone is on the same page. And the hope is that these small adjustments will prevent situations like the one in Austin, where Verstappen's actions were called into question. But ultimately, the drivers are hopeful. Despite all the changes happening within the FIA and the frustration surrounding the regulations, the drivers are still confident in Liberty Media and the leadership of Stefano Domenicali, the CEO of F1. They know that F1 is in a good place, and the focus is on keeping the sport moving forward with stability and growth. The question remains: will the FIA's changes be enough to satisfy everyone? As the dust settles after the FIA's recent changes and the ongoing discussions between drivers and officials, it's clear that there are still a lot of moving pieces in Formula One. With the new track changes coming into play for the Qatar Grand Prix, there's a lot of anticipation about how these tweaks will affect the racing. But the big question still remains: will these changes actually solve the issues that have been causing so much frustration? The track modifications, like the adjustments to overtaking rules, are a step in the right direction. Drivers like Russell and Hamilton have made it clear that the lines between acceptable racing and dangerous moves need to be better defined. And while they're optimistic about the improvements, the underlying issue still lies in the consistency and transparency of how those rules are applied. Russell has said it himself: Formula One is in a good place right now, but it's all about ensuring that the sport stays that way. With so many changes happening behind the scenes at the FIA, it's more important than ever to make sure that the sport doesn't lose its way. The drivers are doing their part to push for improvements, and now it's up to the FIA to listen and act accordingly. For now, everyone's keeping their fingers crossed that the adjustments made for Qatar will help restore some much-needed consistency and fairness to the sport. After all, F1 fans deserve the best, and the drivers want to be able to race knowing that the rules are clear and fairly enforced. With the final races of the season approaching, all eyes will be on how the FIA handles the evolving situation and how it impacts the teams and the championship battle.